14-15 hours, Caribbean Sea. General quarters alarms echoed across the USS Gerald R. Ford as the fleet's radar picture changed in an instant. 4 red tracks had just separated from 2 Venezuelan Su-30 Mk-2 fighters. There was no warning, no exchange, and no chance to slow the moment down. 4 KH-31A high-speed anti-ship missiles were racing across the sky at Mach 3.5, locked on the American carrier group, 78 seconds. That was all the crew had before the incoming payloads reached America's $13 billion centerpiece at sea. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Jack H. Lucas, the code word Vampire cut through every network, signaling an inbound anti-ship threat. Caracas intended this opening move to send a message. The Americans were no longer operating unchallenged in the Caribbean, but as the countdown burned away, a colder truth began to surface. The Venezuelan pilots believed they had caught the fleet off guard. In reality, they had flown straight into a defensive trap that had already been prepared for them. Over the next 12 minutes, the U.S. Navy would reverse the situation in a high-stakes contest of sensors, speed, and split-second decisions, in a way even their Russian advisors had not fully expected. The moment the 4 missiles left their launch rails, the USS Jack H. Lucas, the Navy's most advanced Flight 3 destroyer, and the carrier's close protection shield, took control of the air defense picture. Its Aegis Baseline 10 combat system activated its automated special doctrine without waiting for manual direction. In a fraction of a second, the ship's central computer built the intercept solution. 4 vertical launch cells opened on the destroyer's bow. 4 SM-6 Block 3A long-range interceptors surged upward, climbing through the air to gather speed and energy before turning down toward their targets. But Venezuela and its Russian advisors had planned for that exact response. As soon as the KH-31A missiles detected the interceptors, all 4 dropped into a sea-skimming profile, flying barely 5 meters above the water. At that altitude, the Caribbean waves created a wall of radar clutter. The tracks flickered, vanished, and reappeared on the screen, using the surface of the sea as cover. The first intercept came at 45 kilometers. 2 American SM-6 interceptors correctly predicted the flight path and released their proximity bursts, breaking apart the 2 leading missiles before they could continue forward. The remaining 2, KH-31, has immediately shifted into terminal maneuver mode. They snapped into sharp S-turns under extreme G-force, pushing far beyond what any crewed aircraft could survive. The last 2 SM-6 interceptors were pulled off their perfect lines by the sudden movement, missing by a razor-thin margin. The outer defense layer had been pierced. 2 high-speed threats were still inbound, closing fast on the American formation's flank. The range fell to 25 kilometers. Inside the USS Jack H. Lucas, the combat system was racing to calculate a second engagement solution against the 2 remaining leakers. Then, without warning, the tactical picture collapsed into chaos. From the northeast, only 15 nautical miles away, a cluster of wooden fishing boats that radar had previously marked as harmless civilian traffic suddenly revealed their real purpose. It was the kind of surprise move U.S. intelligence had not fully accounted for. 12 Shahed 136-style loitering drones lifted off almost simultaneously from the boats, turning a single missile engagement into a complex multi-domain saturation scenario. Venezuela understood it could not match the U.S. Navy in a direct exchange of advanced systems, so the plan was simple. Use numbers, confusion, and timing to overwhelm the fleet's decision cycle. Within seconds, the radar picture became crowded with slow, low-signature aerial targets moving unpredictably across the same battle space as the 2 incoming KH-31A high-speed anti-ship missiles. On the screen, it was no longer a clean intercept problem. It was a nightmare of mixed speeds, mixed signatures, and overlapping flight paths. The ship's combat system now faced one of the hardest challenges in modern naval defense: target discrimination. If the radar gave too much attention to the slower drones, it risked losing precious tracking time on the faster inbound missiles. But if it focused only on the missiles, the drone swarm could slip closer and threaten the ship's exposed sensors and communications equipment. The situation became even more complicated when several of the drones began emitting electronic interference. They were not just decoys in the sky. Some were acting as mobile jamming platforms, feeding false returns into the battle space and making the fire control picture harder to trust. The USS Jack H. Lucas was now operating inside a dense electronic warfare environment. Its automated systems began to feel the pressure as they processed 2 completely different threat profiles at once. One extremely fast, the other slow but numerous. The engagement window against the remaining KH-31As was shrinking rapidly. Range, 15 kilometers. This was the moment where training, technology, and nerve had to work as one. With the ship's own radar picture disrupted by the low-altitude swarm, the fleet's combat commander made the call to activate a capability that few navies in the world could match: Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, known as NIFC-CA. The Jack H. Lucas immediately reduced its own fire control emissions and shifted to launch on remote. From that point forward, the targeting data no longer came directly from the destroyer. Instead, it came from an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft flying at roughly 9,000 meters, safely outside the interference zone created by the drone swarm. From above, the E-2D had a cleaner view of the entire battle space. Its powerful UHF radar cut through the electronic noise and separated the fast-moving anti-ship missiles from the slower drones by reading their speed, altitude, and Doppler signatures. That refined fire control quality data was then passed directly to the launch system aboard the Jack H. Lucas. The vertical launch cells opened again. This time, the Lucas fired a rapid salvo of 8 ESSM Block 2 medium-range interceptors. Unlike older systems that depended heavily on continuous guidance from the ship, the ESSM Block 2 carried its own active radar seeker. After launch, the interceptors received updated mid-course guidance from the E-2D, climbed into a high arcing path, passed above the wall of electronic interference, and then turned down toward their assigned targets from above. The ESSM interceptors dropped into the enemy formation like hunting eagles. One KH-31A was struck directly along its upper section, one of the weakest parts of its frame, and broke apart in a flash of orange light. The drone swarm was also quickly cleared from the sky as the other ESSM missiles used their independent seekers to chase down separate targets without needing constant guidance from the ship. And just when it looked as if the American counterattack had worked perfectly, one final variable remained. One KH-31A was still coming. Its control surfaces had been damaged by fragments, but the missile still had enough speed and momentum to keep moving forward on a ballistic path. It had already passed through the medium-range defense layer. Range, 5 kilometers. Time to impact, 4 seconds. The final missile had entered the danger zone, a distance too close for the main interceptors to work effectively because of their minimum engagement limits. Now the last line of defense on the Jack H. Lucas came down to the close-in protection systems mounted near the stern. But there was a problem. Because the damaged missile was flying an unstable path, it was approaching from a blind sector blocked by the ship's own superstructure and mast. The close-in sensors could not get a clean lock through the steel mass of the bridge. The commanding officer had only one option left, and it was a physical gamble. Instead of keeping the bow forward to reduce the ship's radar profile, he ordered a hard 30-degree turn to port at flank speed. The 9,000-ton destroyer shuddered under the force of the maneuver. The deck tilted sharply as the ship leaned into the turn, pushed hard by its own speed and weight. The move exposed the entire broadside, making the ship a much larger target. But it also did something critical. The turn opened the firing arc for the stern-mounted close-in defense systems. It was a harsh trade-off, except greater exposure for one narrow chance to stop the final inbound threat. As the bow swung away, the blind spot disappeared. The defensive system instantly picked up the intense heat signature from the incoming missile's engine. OSRIM-116 interceptor launched from its tube and spun into the air, its infrared seeker guiding it straight toward the approaching target. The intercept happened at extremely close range, only about 400 meters off the ship's beam. The shockwave slammed into the side of the Jack H. Lucas with tremendous force, stripping antennas, damaging exposed equipment, and cracking reinforced glass on the bridge. Hot fragments from the KH-31A scattered across the deck like a storm of burning metal. Damage control alarms echoed throughout the destroyer, but the engines were still running. The ship was still moving. And most importantly, the Jack H. Lucas was still afloat. The gamble had worked. As smoke drifted over the Caribbean Sea, the most intense naval confrontation of the 21st century had lasted barely 78 seconds. On the bridge of the USS Jack H. Lucas, the air felt heavy with ozone, smoke, and raw adrenaline. Then the reports started coming in. The starboard antenna array had been torn away, the radar system had taken damage, the radar-absorbent coating had been torn and scarred by fragments, but the heart of the ship was still alive. The propulsion plant remained stable, the combat systems were still functioning, and the destroyer had stayed in the fight. But survival came at a price. On the balance sheet, the U.S. Navy had just absorbed a painful lesson. Tens of millions of dollars in advanced defensive interceptors had been spent to stop a much cheaper package of incoming threats. In Caracas, Venezuelan leaders believed the exchange had worked in their favor. In their eyes, they had traded low-cost systems for a costly American response, forcing Washington to reconsider the price of staying in the Caribbean. They believed the United States would step back, worried about public reaction and the risk of a longer standoff. They were wrong. Washington did not choose the most obvious response. No large missile barrage, no dramatic display that would create chaos and headlines. Instead, the Pentagon selected a quieter and far more humiliating option, an asymmetric response known as Operation Silent Thunder. 2 hours after the incident, the power grid around Caracas and the military air traffic control network near El Sombrero Air Base went dark at the same time. A coordinated cyber and electronic warfare operation, supported by EA-18G Growler aircraft from the Ford Carrier Group, overwhelmed key Venezuelan military networks and left command systems struggling to respond. At the same time, 2 F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters from the USS Gerald R. Ford slipped into Venezuelan airspace without being detected. Flying extremely low, they approached El Sombrero base, where the 2 Su-30S involved in the earlier incident had just returned. Then, without releasing a single munition, the F-35s passed directly above the runway. As they crossed the base, both aircraft lit their afterburners and pushed through the sound barrier above the hardened shelters. 2 sharp sonic booms split the night like thunder. The pressure waves rolled across the ground, rattling buildings and shattering glass in the control tower. Venezuelan personnel rushed out in confusion, looking up just in time to see 2 bright blue engine signatures climbing into the night sky. No shots were exchanged, no aircraft were lost, no crater was left behind. But the message was impossible to miss. The United States had shown that it could reach the heart of the base at any moment, and that this time it had chosen restraint. The events of January 13th, 2026 ended not with a massive firestorm, but with something far more unsettling: silence. A defense network had gone dark, an airbase had been exposed, and a message had been delivered without a single direct hit. The U.S. Navy had prevailed, but this was not the kind of victory that allowed anyone to relax. Behind the relief was a colder realization. The Aegis shield, long seen as nearly untouchable, had shown real stress when faced with low-cost saturation tactics and electronic interference. The technology gap was still there, but it was no longer as wide as many had assumed. The ocean was no longer a guaranteed safe zone for billion-dollar capital ships. Even the most advanced fleet could be forced into uncomfortable decisions when speed, volume, and deception were used together. And somewhere in Beijing, analysts were almost certainly studying every second of those 78 seconds. Because next time, the opponent may not be Venezuela. Next time, it may be a peer rival with far more aircraft, far more sensors, and far deeper resources. Would the same tactics still work? Would American technology still stay ahead? Or was this only a preview of a much larger challenge waiting over the horizon? That is a question for another episode. One important note before we close: this video is inspired by real-world military capabilities, known defense concepts, and modern naval doctrine. But it is presented as a dramatized what-if scenario. Some details have been adjusted for storytelling, clarity, and visualization. The goal is to explore military thinking, technology, and strategy for educational and entertainment purposes. What do you think about the outcome of this high-stakes chess match at sea? Share your thoughts below, and make sure to follow the channel for the next episode, where we will look at what China may have learned from this scenario and how it could shape the future of naval warfare. Thank you for watching. Class dismissed.